If there's one thing that's at the very heart of JavaScript, and that's creating functions. So what functions do is they allow us to run a block of code. So in order to create a function, so this is a function declaration, and there's also function expression. So I'll tell you the difference between the two. So we've got our function, and it lets us run a block of code, and that's the code that's between the curly brackets. So we'll output something into the console for this function, and normally you'd have quite a bit of code there running, and this is stuff that you would be reusing throughout your application. And in order to invoke a function, you could add it anywhere within the code. So that means that you could write it a bunch of times, and that would run that same piece of code. You can also run it within the console, and that will also run that same piece of code. There's also function expressions, and these are similar to what we saw with when we do the variables. So we give it a name and then assign the function expression on the other side of it. And these operate similar to variables, that we would be able to assign values and we'd be able to reassign different values to the variable test2. So this is a function expression, and we could invoke it the same way with the curly brackets. And the one important distinction is that if we're running, so we could invoke it, but if we're trying to use function declaration, it actually doesn't matter where in the code we place the test1, because we can always invoke the function. So even if the function is created, the function statement is created after we're trying to use it, it's going to still run. And that's not the same for the function expressions, because this will throw an error because it's trying to use it before it's initialized. And you'll also find this the same thing when you've got variables. If you try to use them before you're assigning a value to it, you're going to throw an error. So that's the important distinction. And it's not that one is better than another. It depends on what you're trying to do with the code and what you're most comfortable with as you're writing the code. With functions, you can also pass in values, and you can pick up those values as arguments contained within the function. So for instance, if we had a value of num, and this value can then be output into the console, and it can be used within the function. And it's going to work the same way for the function expressions and the function declarations. So now it's expecting a parameter. So let's give it a parameter of 100. And now we've got quite a bit more flexibility when we're writing the functions, because we see that it's updating depending on the value that we're sending in it, and it's running that block of code with those updated values. You can also return back contents of a function. So for instance, if you created a value for a response, taking number, and let's multiply it by 25, you can return back the response value. And that means that if we did a console log, since we're returning back a value, we see the returned back value within the console. And you can also assign it to variables as well. So if we had test1 100, it's going to run the block of code. So it's outputting into the console, and as well it's returning back that number that we passed in times 25 on the return. Also, one important thing to note with variables and how variables work is these are scope based. So because response is declared within test, that means that I can't use response outside of that block of code. It's not going to know what response means, and I see it throws an error there because it's looking for the variable response, and it looks on its own scope, and if it's not within its own scope, then it looks to the parent scope and it looks to that parent scope. But because this is on the global scope, this is on the root, it doesn't have anywhere to go, it doesn't have anywhere to look back. Whereas over here, if you define a variable 100, and if you try to use it within your function, and I do need to comment that one out, we still need to make sure the order is correct, as we're trying to use the val variable and containing that within test1 before we've declared it. So once we organize it and we declare the variable first, then we run the function is looking for the variable called val. It's looking within the scope, so within the curly brackets. It doesn't find it, so it goes out to the parent where it finds the value of 100, and that's the value that's being returned back within the console. So with functions, there's quite a bit you can do, and we do use functions regularly as we create JavaScript code. So it is important to practice and understand functions. So before the next lesson, go ahead and create a function. Create a function that multiplies two numbers together, returns a response, and output that response in the console. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.